Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I am so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. So would you like to introduce yourself and we'll kind of get started there?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Neil Lamb, and I have the incredible honor of being the president of the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology here in Huntsville, Alabama.
Yeah, so I got to interview Neil for the podcast for the Chamber of Commerce. Had a fantastic time doing it. So I was like, I have to have him on my podcast. We can talk a little bit more in depth on some different things than we did on that podcast, but it was a great conversation. So I'm excited to kind of dig deeper into some of those topics that we discussed and kind of talk about some other things. But talk a little bit about your journey to get to Hudson Alpha, because I know that you've been there since the very beginning. I mean, you saw just when it was just red dirt and there really wasn't that much of a facility to now what it is today.
Clark, would you like me to start with my journey that's brought me to where I am all the way from when I was a young kid, or do you want me to start just with my journey around Hudson Alpha? What's your preference?
So I know that you married a Huntsville native, so that's what kind of brought you to Huntsville. But talk a little bit about sort of your getting your doctorate at Emory, correct? And then coming from Emory to Huntsville to work for Hudson Alpha.
Yeah, sure. So I was a Chattanooga boy. That's where I was raised. I got my undergraduate degree at Auburn and then went to Emory for my PhD in human genetics, just like you said. Took a couple of years after I got my PhD and did kind of a side role. I worked in a really large church outside of science. Came back into science as a faculty member at Emory and taught in the med school and did a lot of education. Education has really always been one of my key passions. And so I was in a very research-intensive department at Emory, but doing a lot of education and partnering with different groups. My wife, as you mentioned, is a Huntsville native, and so we would always come back for holidays and gatherings, and we loved the community of Huntsville. But at that point in time, there wasn't... The biotech presence was really just building, but there wasn't a place that was a logical fit for me. So fast forward, it's now 2006. I've been asked to help write a book, a genetics textbook for college students. And as they pull all the authors together, one of the people that I meet is Dr. Rick Myers, who is our president emeritus and the chief science officer, but at that point was the department chair at Stanford and sat on the earliest search committee around Hudson Alpha in its very early days.
And so around what year was this?
So this is probably spring of 2006.
Okay.
They've had the announcement about Hudson Alpha a few months earlier that there was going to be this place. I knew that there was going to be a strong research and economic development presence. Didn't know much about the education piece. And I met Rick, and Rick talked to me about the fact that I do education, but I'm a trained human geneticist, and would I ever be interested in exploring more about Hudson Alpha? And a week later, I was in an interview with Jim Hudson and the late Lonnie McMillan, the co-founders of the Institute, and they brought me, like you said, to the red dirt, to the hole in the ground.
Yeah.
And with their words, they built the vision for Hudson Alpha, and they built the building in front of me.
Was it hard for you to capture that vision when they were talking about it? Or could you see exactly what they were talking about and discussing and envisioning, and then seeing it today, did it meet the expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. They did a really good job of saying, imagine a space where, and imagine people in this space that are coming from multiple different perspectives, that have a strong research background making discoveries, that are really interested in how they start a company and using those discoveries, or have an existing company and want to relocate to Huntsville because of the energy and the knowledge that's here. Imagine what that could look like for the community. Imagine that we could train the next generation of people in this. So they did a really great job of imagine if, and less of, and here will be a room that does this or that does that. And because they painted that vision in such imagine the functional impact of that, it's been great to watch that really come to life. And because
it was more like, I mean, even today, what Hudson Alpha is more of, it's not necessarily what's being done in Hudson Alpha, it's what Hudson Alpha is impacting outside of Hudson Alpha.
That's a great way to think about that. There's so much that goes on on the campus, within the buildings, but all of that work has massive impact for the region, for the state, for the community, and really for the world. Our mission statement is using the power of genomics to impact life, to make the world a better place. And it is how is what we do here shaping the impact on the world? Yeah. So they painted that picture for me. And then they took me back to the Adtran building, the company that Lonnie McMillan co-founded, and they laid out the blueprints. So then we actually saw, here's what the building would look like. And we started talking about a teaching lab and what an education space could look like. And they offered me the job then and there. Jim said, let's just cut to the chase. Can you be here in August? And I paused for maybe a heartbeat and said, we have some things we need to talk about, but yes, I can. I was captivated and hooked with the vision of making the world a better place and the education role specifically of creating a more genomically literate society and training the next generation of workers, not just in Huntsville, but around the state. I knew it was what I had to be a part of, because I would probably never get the chance to be at the ground level with something that had the potential for that broad of an impact. And so I went back to Emory and resigned and took a job with an organization that no one had ever heard of, that didn't have a building and didn't have, its first set of equipment. And it's amazing now, 16 years later, 17 years, the buildings have been open for 16 years. I've been with the Institute almost 18 years to see the overall impact really built around the strength of that vision and the people that they recruited to the table.
Yeah. I mean, the impact and just envisioning Research Park in 2006 when you see this place. I mean, it's envisioning Huntsville even. I mean, I'm a Huntsville native myself, and the way that Huntsville's grown really over the last, since I really graduated high school, so 2017, 2015, 2017 is when everything sort of started clicking as far as these new things were coming, these new initiatives were coming, but HudsonAlpha has always kind of been a part of that. But I feel like now the stage at which Huntsville's at, HudsonAlpha is able to kind of exceed and be seen even more than what it was then. Even though a lot of the work necessarily being done there is work that's been done there for a while. How do you think just the impact of this Huntsville itself and the growth of Huntsville has directly impacted the growth of HudsonAlpha and its visibility, not only in the state or in the city, but across the country?
Yeah. So let's go back a second. You said that you feel like maybe 2015, 2016 on is when a lot of when for you, a lot of that growth, I think it's fell into place.
I think that's when I first started noticing it. Because I think, when you're graduating high school, and for most people that are Huntsville natives, it's let's get as far away from Huntsville as possible. Huntsville's just not cool. And so when I graduated high school, it's like, okay, let's see if Huntsville, I was going to school here, staying here, going to Calhoun and UAH. Like, I need to make Huntsville cool because I want my friends when they come back to see it too. And so that's when I started to first kind of venture out to see these things that maybe I didn't see before or didn't notice before. But DHI and Downtown Huntsville Inc. and that organization started around 2017 with Chad Emerson, kind of revitalizing the area. And so that's the clicking of in my head of like when this upward trend for Huntsville started.
And I would say that actually a lot of the groundwork for that, the foundational work, was laid years earlier. I mean, even going all the way back to, certainly with Von Braun and the rocket work, but with establishing Cummings Research Park, this enormous amount of land set aside for these purposes, and then thinking about how do you build on the strengths of aerospace and defense, but how do you expand that and diversify that with things like biosciences? And Jim Hudson was one of the early proponents of what today we would think of as live, work, play in downtown living, with some of the first, he brought some of the earliest really high-end restaurants into the region and some of the early loft living spaces. So sort of seeing what would be needed to create that. And HudsonAlpha, I think, is a part of that. And those early years of HudsonAlpha built the foundation for a lot of the growth, the early recruiting of some of our key faculty, the bringing some of the initial companies in place and giving them what they need to grow and expand, getting the education programs underway, so that you really are seeing the first fruits. I'm not even the first fruits. You're seeing the most recent growth of that. If I can digress just a second, let's do a quick science analogy.
Oh, for sure.
If you think about a cube of ice and you add heat to it, and ultimately it moves from a solid to a liquid. So now I've got a puddle of water. And if I keep adding heat, ultimately it will boil and turn to steam, and so it will turn to a gas. So that set of changes, if I were to track the temperature of that water at those different stages, I am adding heat I'm adding more and more heat, but I'm not necessarily seeing a significant change in the temperature or I'm pouring heat in, but I'm not seeing a visible shift until I reach a tipping point.
Yeah.
And then I see a really massive
For sure.
change. I think that same sort of thing happens with Huntsville, happens with HudsonAlpha, happens with all successful companies. You put a lot of energy in, and it takes a while before you see all those structures beginning to come into place, and then it really takes off.
And I think the analogy too of like when you go to the beach and there's those big high rises, and the higher the high rise, the deeper it has to go because it needs to support what's above it.
That's
and so
a great way to think
I think
about
those early years in HudsonAlpha and those early years for Huntsville in general, were just building that foundation, because at the end of the day, it's like the success and maybe the visibility that Huntsville's getting today would not have been possible without those early foundations to be put in place. I mean, thinking through just the impact that HudsonAlpha has been able to have, I mean, the campus itself has grown immensely over the years. Talk a little bit about how the campus has grown its presence here in Huntsville, but also kind of reaching out into other areas throughout the state. I know the Wiregrass region, kind of near Dothan, has been a big area of impact, but there's also been other areas that y'all are trying to kind of have a presence in.
Yeah. So the Institute right now, if you walk, the Institute itself, the nonprofit HudsonAlpha, has about 220 people on it. So that covers our researchers, that covers our education team, that covers the people that focus really in on how we grow economic development, how we recruit and retain companies, and then all the administrative support, from the people that keep the building looking beautiful every day to the people that make sure that everybody who works at HudsonAlpha gets paid. That's about 220 people. The total growth on campus. So there are now over 50 biotech companies that call HudsonAlpha's campus home.
Wow.
So many of them have been recruited in, or people in Huntsville with an idea and wanted a place to grow. Some of those ideas some of the companies have spun out of research at HudsonAlpha. A core set of those companies were in Huntsville from the very beginning.
Okay.
But that 50 plus number of companies now means that you've got over 900 employees on the broader HudsonAlpha campus that are not part of the nonprofit. They're part of those tenant companies.
Wow.
And that's where we've seen just massive growth as we have expanded out and built additional buildings and recruited new companies or grown companies from within. So one of the visions of Jim and Lonnie was to have a specific gravity, a high enough mass of companies and researchers that if something happened to any one of the companies, maybe they were sold and moved somewhere else, you still had that energetic presence. And I think we now see that 1,200 people across the campus really is a strong biotech presence in the region.
Wow.
And so now we've taken that and looked at how do we expand and build on that. Science is never done in a vacuum. And so on the research side, we've got partnerships not only with groups like UAB and UAH and Auburn and A&M, but with research teams really across the country and around the world. And that's also true with the companies on the campus. They've got partnerships and collaborations. But we're actually looking at how do we take the impact of HudsonAlpha and set up an additional instance in other places across the state. And that really brings us to the Wiregrass, which you just mentioned, the work that we're doing with the city of Dothan and the broader Wiregrass community to establish an additional instance of HudsonAlpha that uses the research, that focuses on how do we make new discoveries, how do we recruit and grow companies into the Wiregrass, specifically around the field of agri-science, and then how do we bring education in that brings cutting-edge tools and techniques to middle school and high school students and partners with the area community colleges like Wallace State Community College and nearby Troy University, and build that workforce that is excited about being in that region and working with the research and the economic development. So you are seeing the model of HudsonAlpha that we've seen do so well here in Huntsville now take root in another part of the state. And we could not ask for a better group of people to work with than the amazing folks in Dothan and the broader Wiregrass. And that initiative is about 18 months old.
Wow.
And really growing. We are developing new varieties of peanuts, which, the Wiregrass grows a huge amount of the country's peanut supply. Those peanuts often have been bred and developed in other states, not necessarily specific to the unique climate and water and soil that you find here in Alabama. So we're helping build new varieties and using high school students to actually design and develop that using the power of genomics. So we're teaching them skills that you typically wouldn't see until graduate school, but they are understanding the science for something that they see value in their own community that ultimately brings benefit back. And then recruiting in companies. And it's just exciting. It's like the early days of HudsonAlpha here in Huntsville as we began to try to think about how do we put our arms around this and build the infrastructure around this vision of the co-founders.
Yeah, I mean, was that vision of opening and kind of this model that HudsonAlpha has created, was there always the intention to bring this model to other areas, or did that opportunity just kind of come about, 3 or 4 years ago, and then this has now happened? Or is that something that's always kind of been within the ethos of HudsonAlpha?
It's always been important for HudsonAlpha to have a benefit across the state, and not simply, even though we sit in the Huntsville one of the Huntsville zip codes, to have an impact that was truly beneficial across the state. With that, the thought or the focus has been, how do we grow that benefit while still keeping our people on the Huntsville campus?
Yeah.
So the opportunity really came to us through the leadership of some key community leaders in Dothan, and bringing Dothan Mayor Mark Saliba to the table to start a conversation around saying to HudsonAlpha, would you ever consider taking what you've done in Huntsville and thinking about applying it to another metropolitan area?
Yeah.
And that started about 2 years of in-depth conversations and brainstorming and dreaming and talking with a lot of leaders about what it might look like to think about HudsonAlpha with a second instance. And the Wiregrass is a beautiful, perfect place for that. A lot of our research ties to human health, especially disorders of the brain. And that still is focused here in Huntsville. We have a huge growing ag research arena, both here in Huntsville, but that's a beautiful transition and translation into the Wiregrass as well. So you've got both the human health and the ag here on the Huntsville campus, and we're specifically growing the ag in the Wiregrass with, ideas that somewhere down the road, the human health may find its way there as well.
Yeah. And I would assume too, with the kind of this adoption of what's happening at the Wiregrass area with HudsonAlpha, and kind of that its presence there is also a lot to do with the economic development and workforce development, because getting those high school students to see what they can do and stay here at home to do it.
Yes.
Because I think like the talent, you want to cultivate good talent, but you also want to keep good talent. And you want to say that like you can do these cool and amazing things, you don't have to leave home.
That's right.
And I think the same is true for Huntsville, and with the work you do with other institutions here in Huntsville, with high schools. I feel like there's sometimes a misconception that sometimes Huntsvillians can have with HudsonAlpha, is they think, like you mentioned, that everything within HudsonAlpha is HudsonAlpha. And I think that associate company element of it is such a unique thing. What are some of the ways in which you're able to get that message across of what HudsonAlpha really is to not only the Huntsville community, but when you're pitching it to these new communities all across the state?
You've hit on one of our strengths, and also I think one of the challenges of HudsonAlpha. The strength being that we have a threefold mission. So we are focused on research, bringing the power of research into economic development and helping recruit and grow companies, and then creating education for public awareness and for workforce development. That is a beautiful blend of all these pieces that fit together. And with our research, both in human health and in ag, but it also means we have multiple stories to tell. So I can't simply say, HudsonAlpha does this thing. HudsonAlpha makes this widget or studies this disease. So I have to be able to engage you in a conversation that is going to last more than 30 seconds so I can begin to paint the breadth of what we do. And sometimes that's a little bit challenging. People often think Hudson Alpha just does this facet of our work or just does this component and don't recognize the huge breadth of what we do. But if we can have people, even if they come through the doorway of one specific, they're part of a clinical research study, or they're a farmer and they know about our work developing new varieties of barley or peanuts, or they know that we recruit companies to the campus. Whatever door they walk through, we want to be able to talk about everything that goes on at the Institute, because I think the secret sauce is the fact that you can tackle really hard problems with all three of those mission areas at the table. You can say, what can the science tell us? And where are the places where we can do more scientific discovery to help uncover answers? But then how do we apply that? How do we bring either the companies that are already here or our expertise in recruiting and growing new companies to try to take those science findings and turn them into meaningful products that have benefit? And then how do I build the workforce that has those skills, understands why this is important, and wants to be in whatever community it is that we're talking about?
Yeah.
And because we are not one thing, we can recruit multiple different players. So we often can serve as the hub of a much larger network because we are able to speak all of these different languages, and we've got all these different relationships.
Yeah, and I think the design element of Hudson Alpha lends itself to showing that collaborative nature. I mean, I think just as soon as you walk in, and I think I would push anybody that's listening, that's like if they're a Huntsville native, if they've just moved to Huntsville recently, to like visit the campus, because I think the campus itself tells the story. And I think being able to, like, hearing you discuss and talk about how all these different elements are kind of working under one roof, but being able to walk into the main building at Hudson Alpha and the huge atrium and just like taking all of that in it's an experience I think everyone should be a part of, because it is such a unique, the design element, you can see the intention behind everything that you've done. How do you keep that intention as Hudson Alpha is growing at the rate it's growing? Because not like when it was a blank canvas, you could really do with it what you wanted. But now it's as you've kind of not necessarily reached capacity at Research Park, but you've definitely taken over more of a footprint. How do you continue to have that intention behind the design element of your buildings that allows the synergy among the people that are occupying them?
It is a driving piece that we think about with whether we're talking about a new idea that we're bringing to the table or expansion on the campus or recruiting. It was very important to Jim and Lonnie from the beginning that the space allowed for collaboration. Jim calls it random collisions of brilliance. So the idea that people who are coming from different perspectives, different backgrounds, have a place where they can gather and share ideas, and something amazing can take place. So whether that's ensuring that many of our buildings have lots of light and lots of glass and it's easy to see people and there's a lot of common space, or whether it's just the intentionality of looking down our campus that McMillan Park, which is kind of this central beautiful greenway, this walkway, the spine, is narrow enough that people can come out of buildings on either side of McMillan Park and recognize a face and come together and have a conversation in the middle. So we are not quite 50% of our campus now is built out.
Okay.
So there's a significant amount of room for additional growth. But now you've got people in different buildings. So how do you ensure that people are having those conversations across buildings? So it's very intentionally doing things like Science on Tap, where multiple times a year we invite the Institute in, and we have beer and soda and pizza, and there's a researcher that's speaking, and there's somebody from one of the associate companies, and it's that intentional gathering. Or Hudson Alpha Hangout, which is a chance to come play trivia or listen to a music group, or something like Field Day, where everybody puts on athletic clothes and competes in zany things. How do we intentionally build in opportunities for people to interact? And our economic development team is very, very intentional in how they think about that, as is our HR team and other groups. How can we leverage what's already on the campus, but intentionally make sure people don't just walk in whatever building they're in and go to sit in their workstation, but are out interacting with other people.
Yeah, and I think that culture element, I mean, I think that's one of the most, I think, unique things about the Huntsville community or about Huntsville companies in general is their intentional effort to build culture. And I think Hudson Alpha has done the same thing. I mean, you're building the culture at which Lonnie McMillan and Jim Hudson had envisioned. And then though over the years it's kind of, taken some twists and turns a little bit along the way, you still have the underlying culture. And I think that culture is important as you've expanded its presence here in Huntsville, but also your presence in other states or in other cities throughout the state. Looking as we're recording this in May of 2024, almost the end of May, what does the rest of 2024 look like for Hudson Alpha, for its efforts in other parts of the state, maybe even future offices and buildings all across the. I mean, I think there's so much happening. I've been fortunate enough to see it when I did some work with Carter Wells, and we got to talk to people all throughout the state. And I think figuring out a way, and I feel like that's probably your role almost every day, is figuring out a way for all these people to get to know each other. How do you see the rest of 2024 looking, and maybe even the next few years?
Yeah. And I love that question because it's one that is very forward thinking, exciting about what comes next. So clearly the relationship with the Wiregrass continues to grow and develop, and we're really excited about deepening that. The Wiregrass, the city of Dothan has just broken ground on a Wiregrass Innovation Center in downtown Dothan that Hudson Alpha Wiregrass will be the anchor tenant in. So we're so excited about what that means and about what that physical space looks like in building out that relationship. I think that's going to give us a lot of lessons as we think about, are there other places where you could begin to follow this model? Maybe it's not agriscience. Maybe it's in some other component of the life sciences, but where you could bring another instance of Hudson Alpha to the table. We've got some lessons still to learn as we figure that out. Here in Huntsville, we've just brought a brand new researcher on board, Dr. Andy Kadani, who's come to us from St. Jude. And his work beautifully ties in with the research that many of our scientists are doing around disorders of the brain, understanding rare and undiagnosed neurological disorders, digging deep into the cause of neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and thinking about neuropsychiatric illness. And Andy brings this beautiful skill set that complements our existing scientists and takes us deeper into, here's the genetic change. What's the impact on that cell? How can I look at that live, in 3D and understand the biological meaning of that genetic change, and then begin to think about therapeutic options or ways to try to restore the cell back to a typical balance. So we are so excited to welcome him and help him begin to build his research. The plant work on the campus continues to grow. We opened the Kathy Chan greenhouse about a year and a half ago, and we continue to bring more and more plant-based research and experiments into that space. And one of the ones that I'm super excited about is a project called Greening the Southeast. And Dr. Sam Jackson is the director of that, along with Jeremy Schmutz and Dr. Kankshita Swaminathan. And that hits at what we talked about earlier around all three mission areas. And it's the idea that so many of the things that we buy, that either as individual pieces, whether we're talking about takeout packages or cars or construction materials, so many of those things are still made from petroleum-based products. Or if we're trying to go green and buy recyclable or biodegradable, we're actually having to buy them from other parts of the country or from other countries in Asia. And any benefit that you might get is totally lost in everything you have to spend on transport and getting it here.
Wow.
Alabama has a super rich history of agriculture, and we're bringing together researchers, industry leaders, and educators and workforce to say, can we think about perennial grasses? These are things like miscanthus and switchgrass that you plant once, and once you get them started, they grow almost anywhere, but they don't have to have super phenomenal soil. They can grow on soil that you can't grow other cash crops on. You plant them once, you harvest them every year, you get all this massive amount of shoots and leaves. Those shoots and leaves at their heart are just chemical building blocks of carbons, oxygen, and hydrogen. And you can take those shoots and leaves and stems and chop them up, and then you can convert them into biodegradable silverware or food packaging. Or you can think about the foam that sits inside of chairs or your car or an airplane, or green-based car parts or green construction material. If we can grow those kinds of crops and use our understanding of genetics to really identify the best varieties to thrive in Alabama, and we can partner with Alabama's existing strengths in the automobile manufacturing and in groups like Airbus and in our construction industry that are looking for green products that have a lower environmental footprint, and we can figure out how you connect the middle group of okay, I've grown these plants, now I harvest them and prepare them to make these kinds of products that these car manufacturers want. You've now built a biocircular economy here in Alabama that meets the needs of consumers and industries, but uses products that Alabama farmers are growing that we have the natural resources for. And at the same time, you are helping to benefit the environment and carbon footprint, and you are producing things that consumers want. That's a huge undertaking. A huge undertaking, but it's transformative because it offers farmers an opportunity to grow things on land that they can't grow on right now, and you are building the industries that are taking that raw material and converting them to the basic parts that your suppliers then need. So that brings the genomic science together to figure out the basic pieces. It brings the industry players to the table, the new industry that emerges, and then all the workforce development and the education around that. That, I've used the word transformative, but I'll use it again. That is an exciting opportunity for the state of Alabama, and Hudson Alpha sits kind of at the center of that in partnership with groups like Auburn University and Alabama A&M and these other players. That's the kind of big thinking that both keeps me up at night, but really, really excites me. And I think you're going to see more of those kinds of pieces come out of Hudson Alpha in the coming years, and then continued growth to bring new companies on campus and to continue to recruit and strengthen that bioscience economy that I think is so beneficial as a diverse part of the workforce of North Alabama.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you talk about just the Going Green initiative. I recently talked with the marketing director of TVG Hospitality that does the Orion, and they have a huge initiative there with their reusable cups that they do, and it's a huge element of their footprint that is now being replicated and being seen and being heard by other amphitheaters and music venues all across the Southeast, all across the country, really, that are trying to take notice and kind of thinking how they can do something like that too. And I think that's such a unique thing, and that there's two unique industries like the Orion and like Hudson Alpha that in proximity are very close to each other and are doing very similar things. And I think that is such a cool thing with Huntsville, is that though the city is growing exponentially, I mean, it's incredible to be a part of. It's incredible to see that there's still that 1 degree of separation between a lot of people. And I think and that's going to continue to happen just because of the back to the very beginning of our conversation, the foundation that we've built. It's easy to tell from the conversation that we've had so far that education and talking about the work you do is part of you. How do you continue to kind of dive into that educational element of the work that you really kind of brought you to Hudson Alpha while being in the role of president?
The education team is now led by Kelly East. She's the vice president for education outreach, and she and that team do an amazing job. I had the incredible joy of helping start that team and building that, but Kelly was one of the earliest employees and has really now in the last couple of years taken it to even larger heights. So they still periodically let me back in those spaces and have conversations with teachers and the public and with students, which I love. My role as president involves a lot of talking about what the Institute is and does and the benefit, the leverage that we can bring. So I get to talk about the education, and I get to educate about Hudson Alpha and about science in those ways. And I spend a lot of time talking to leaders around the country about the work that we do. So that feeds my education minded soul.
Yeah, and like I guess you're still educating, like you mentioned. Just the receiver of the knowledge is a little bit different than what it used to be. You get to do things like this. You get to do things maybe when it's more of a press release. It's more of a going down to Dothan and talking with people there. But I've appreciated having you on and talking a little bit about just the journey of Hudson Alpha, your journey with Hudson Alpha, and then future initiatives. We'll have to have you back on in a couple of years to kind of to address some of the things that maybe we've talked about that maybe will be at fruition or have some more substance behind them in the next few years. But I appreciate you taking the time.
I'd love to do that again, Clark, at any point. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to unpack a little bit more about what Hudson Alpha is and does, and maybe help some of your listeners who may know a little bit about Hudson Alpha now have maybe a fuller picture of everything that takes place in that space.
Awesome. Well, I thank you again, and I look forward to having you back on in a few years.
Deal.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.